Today we are going to explore T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, the supreme poetic achievement of literary modernism, published in 1922. Here we are going to be grappling with the after effects of the age of ideology whose authors we have been dealing with in the last few weeks in the Great Conversation. Europe was advancing in the world, was imperialistically controlling much of the destiny of the rest of the nations. And there was a scientific, evolutionistic optimism that history was progressing, full emancipation from old regimes, old authority structures was on the verge of occurring, that we would finally have a new dawn. But this, of course, came into the most devastating catastrophe of World War I. And it is in the aftermath of that devastation that Eliot writes his poem. It is also relevant for us in our own time after the Spanish flu of 1918, well, the flu that ravaged the world after the First World War. And in his own life, Eliot was dealing with a very painful marital situation. In this poem, which many people find so compelling despite its difficulty, and I will say that up front, it is a very difficult poem to deal with, but it is worth dealing with, because I believe that it gives us essential guidance into how we should live in a dying civilization. Now, one might question, well, is the West dying? This age of ideology saw Western Europe take global hegemony. Is that ideal dying? Is that civilization in trouble, in crisis? I think there is a very real case to be made that we are still in crisis, even though we're a century out from the catastrophe of World War I. In any case, the question of cultural renewal is always going to be on our agenda, and that is something else The Wasteland talks about. It's not a completely pessimistic poem. In fact, I believe that there's a profound sense of hope to be found in the poem, but it is not a cheap hope. It's a hope that has to deal with the memory of suffering, the memory of the dead, that you can only get renewal by being true to what has been lost and true to the predicament, the precariousness of our situation now. So I find that The Wasteland is essential reading for our living our lives in a advanced industrialized or post-industrial civilization that is in many ways spiritually lost, that is still spiritually devastated. As far as an aid to reading the poem, and in the Great Conversation book, you only have the poem itself. There are footnotes that Eliot included and that he had prepared for the edition. He would later try to pretend that it was just to bulk up the manuscript to make it book length, but I think he understood that the obscurity of his poem required certain elucidation. It is worth looking at those footnotes at some point, but not the first time around. But it's good to know that, for instance, this website has a nice arrangement of both the epigraph, which we don't include in the volume either, and the footnotes. So you can look up eliotwasteland.tripod.com. But my recommendation is that you read through the poem once without stopping. There are many different languages that show up in the poem, and that's difficult and annoying, but it's still worth trying to get the sense of the music in your head and just to let it wash over you. I think that's the first thing. When I first confront a new symphony, that's what I do. I just listen to it. It's only the second time when you start to actually hear things, and I think that applies to poetry. So just read it. But then the second time, you'll want to start to look for not every reference, because if you were to look up all the allusions that are in this poem, it would drive you nuts. It takes forever. For instance, there's a very important German quote right at the beginning in the first section, and that's worth looking up the second time you read it. So when you go back to the poem the second time, think about the images, desert, dryness, water. Think about the voices. They are so various. In fact, the original title that Eliot gave the poem was "He'd Do the Police in Different Voices," which is a quote from a Dickens novel about a character who has this ability to read entertainingly from the police reports. And so he's saying, I've got a lot of voices. It's right up front. It's really a polyphonic dramatic monologue. So you've got these different voices, and it's not clear how they merge together. I don't want to reduce that ambiguity, but he does say in the footnotes something that I think we have to take as an important key to interpreting the poem, even though a poet is never the total master of his or her poem. So that if you get a reading that is making sense of various aspects of the poem, it's going to be valid in its own way, regardless of what the poet thinks. But it's worth knowing what a poet thinks too. He says Tiresias, who's this character from Greek mythology, he shows up in the second part of this poem. He says what Tiresias sees there, in fact, is the substance of the poem. It's worth taking that seriously and seeing if that helps to understand how the voices constellate and how they mesh with each other. Another thing to look at is the different rhetorical strategies. You're going to find that the rhetoric being used is very different. You'll have some very colloquial passages. You'll have some very prophetic, elevated discourse. You'll have sometimes a different kind of elevated discourse, Shakespearean. It's worth seeing where these occur and how they come up against each other. It's just one way of dealing with poetry, because in the end, a poem is not there as a puzzle to be solved. It's there above all as an experience to change you, if it's any good. So that's really, I would counsel being very patient with the ambiguities here, because they're never actually going to fully resolve. If the poem is any good, the ambiguities are always going to perdure. But the more meaning we can gather out of it, the more our lives can be illuminated, right? So we can bring more and more meaning all the time, each time we come to the poem, but we definitely want to allow the poem to continue to radiate something new each time we come to it. The poem is divided into 5 sections. The first is the burial of the dead. It signals right away that we're talking about the memory of the dead, what we do with a civilization that is burdened with the dead. The next 2 sections, A Game of Chess and the Fire Sermon, really bring up the issue of female suffering. And I think that we need to be very attuned to that. What's going on? How is Eliot bringing to our attention this great horror of female victimization? And one of the narratives that he's drawing off of throughout this poem is Ovid's account of the rape of Philomela, and that's very important for the story. When you hear the nightingale go jug jug, that's because Philomela has been turned into a nightingale after she's been raped and mutilated. Her tongue was cut out by her rapist so that she couldn't give an account. And that's important. The jug jug is the stylized way of representing the nightingale song. So that's going to show up a few places in the poem, and it's important. Another narrative that's kind of in the background of the whole poem are the Grail romances, including the tale of the Fisher King. That is, somehow a sick king has a sick land. If you heal the king, somehow the land is going to get better. Are we the king? How do we stand to the health of the land in which we live? So that's in the second 2 sections, A Game of Chess and the Fire Sermon. I believe that number 4, Death by Water, which is the shortest section by far, is the key to the whole poem. I believe there's baptismal imagery there, so that you have death, but then you now are pivoting to renewal, resurrection, as it were. That's a suggestion. And then finally we have this theophanic, this revelation of the divine and what the thunder said. So in the predicament of our death-laden society, our death-laden Western civilization, Eliot presents this response. And this response is basically da, which is the Sanskrit word for the root of all of our words for to give, data, and so it's give in different forms. It's going to be understood in 3 ways. Da, da, da. Somehow giving is going to be the pivot of renewal. So that's a basic overview. I'll just read a couple of passages to help get the music of the thing in our ears. We know the first stanza, I think most of us know this, but when he goes into the very vatic, prophetic, elevated discourse right after his colloquial opening, well, Chaucerian and then colloquial opening, he says, "Only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust." Then he gives a German song. "Frisch weht der Wind der Heimat zu, mein irdisch Kind, wo weilest du?" It's from Wagner's Tristan und Isolde. And that's a reference then also to the Grail legend, because Tristan, that story gets drawn into that complex of stories. "Fresh blows the wind to the homeland. My Irish child, where do you stay? You gave me hyacinths first a year ago. They called me the hyacinth girl. Yet when we came back late from the hyacinth garden, your arms full and your hair wet, I could not speak and my eyes failed. I was neither living nor dead and I knew nothing, looking into the heart of light. The silence. Öd und leer das Meer." A second quote from Tristan. There it's desolate and empty, the sea, meaning the dying Tristan is looking for his love, and there is no love there. So between the prophetic voice and the second quotation from Tristan, you've got this experience of first love. And it's worth just thinking back to your own experiences of such a love and trying to bring that to bear in the poem. It'll make this live for you. The second section, A Game of Chess, begins with this very high-blown Shakespearean, it's a reference to Cleopatra in Antony and Cleopatra. "The chair she sat in like a burnished throne glowed on the marble where the glass held up by standards wrought with fruited vines from which a golden Cupidon peeped out. Another hid his eyes behind his wing. Doubled the flames of 7-branched candelabra, reflecting light upon the table as the glitter of her jewels rose to meet it. From satin cases poured in rich profusion, in vials of ivory and colored glass. Unstoppered lurked her strange synthetic perfumes. Unguent, powder, or liquid, troubled, confused, and drowned the scents and odors, stirred by the air that freshened from the window. These ascended in fattening, the prolonged candle flames flung their smoke into the laquearia, stirring the pattern on the coffered ceiling. Huge seawood fed with copper burned green and orange, framed by the colored stone in which sad light a carved dolphin swam. Above the antique mantle was displayed, as though a window gave upon the sylvan scene, the change of Philomel by the barbarous king so rudely forced. Yet there the nightingale filled all the desert with inviolable voice, and still she cried, and still the world pursues, jug, jug, to dirty ears." So you've got this sumptuous room and a picture of a scene of great violence. And Eliot is trying to awaken us to the suffering that gets lost in the bourgeois comfort of our world. That's part of what he's doing here. And I'll end by noting that the epigraph, which we didn't include in the volume here, the epigraph is from Petronius' Satyricon, and it's in Latin and Greek, and this is typically Eliotian. But it's the Cumaean Sibyl is trapped in a jar. She's falling apart. She's asked for as many years of life as grains of sand as she had in her hand, and Apollo gave this to her, but he being not a good god, gave her that length of life without giving her youthfulness to go along with it. So these boys have come upon the Sibyl in her jar, and they ask her what she wants. And this is in Greek, Sibylla titeles. And she responds, Aposanein thelo, I want to die. And it's that death instinct which overcomes us in our darkest moments, it overcame Europe after the age of ideology gave way to the First World War. The question is there some new life that can arise after this death wish has invaded our hearts? I believe that Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, gives us an opening, a way for us to walk so that we might be able to say yes again to life.